Montana Territory, winter of 1885. You lied to me, Clara cried, standing in the freezing rain with a revolver aimed at the cowboy's heart. Her face was pale with betrayal, one trembling hand pressed against her 7-month pregnant belly. Jace Caldwell slowly raised his hands. I came here for the twins. Clara's eyes widened. The orphans I rescued with my last dollar. They re not just orphans, he confessed, his voice breaking. They re my brother S. children, and your dead husband helped murder their parents. Clara's breath stopped as thunder rolled across the valley. How could one pregnant widow, single dollar, and a cowboy's buried secret change? 3 children, S. destiny forever. Stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and let the story begin. The wind off the Montana ridge felt like a physical blow. Clara Miller pulled her wool shawl tighter. She was 25. She was 7 months pregnant, and she was entirely alone. Arthur was dead. Her husband had left her with a mountain of debt and a farm that was slowly freezing to death. But Clara wasn't here to beg. She stood outside the Harlan County orphanage. Her fingers gripped a single silver dollar in her coat pocket. It was the last coin to her name. She pushed the heavy oak door open. The room inside smelled like boiled cabbage and stale fear. Behind a scarred wooden desk sat Mr. Grimes. He was a small, sharp-eyed man. He managed the county's unwanted children. More accurately, he managed them right into the pockets of Silas Vance. Vance was the richest cattle baron in the valley. He swallowed up land and people with the same greedy appetite. Clara saw them immediately. 2 kids huddled in the corner by a cold iron stove, a boy and a girl, twins. They couldn't have been more than 9 years old. They were thin. Dirt streaked their cheeks. The boy had a dark swelling bruise under his left eye. He stood slightly in front of his sister, shielding her. Clara's chest tightened. Mrs. Miller, Grimes said. He didn't stand up. He looked at her swollen belly. You shouldn't be out in this weather. The bank is going to take your farm anyway. I'm not here about the farm, Clara said. Her voice was steady. It didn't shake. She walked to the desk. I'm here for the children. Grimes blinked. Then he laughed. A harsh, scraping sound, those 2. Leo and Lily. You can't feed yourself. Widow, besides. Mr. Vance has made arrangements. They're being sent away tonight. Better facilities. Sent away. Clara knew what that meant. Vance wanted the twins gone. There were rumors about their parents' land. If the kids disappeared, Vance took it all. Clara pulled her hand from her pocket. She slammed the silver dollar down on the desk. The heavy coin rang out against the wood. Administrative fee, Clara said. Grimes stared at the coin. Are you crazy? I am taking them, Clara said. She leaned over the desk. You are running a county facility. Grimes, you answer to the state. If those children aren't signed over to me in the next 5 minutes, I will send a telegraph to the state inspector in Helena. I will tell them exactly what kind of arrangements you make for Silas Vance. Grimes' face turned a nasty shade of red. He looked at the dollar. He looked at Clara's eyes. He saw no bluff there. You're making a mistake, he muttered. He pulled a ledger toward him. They're trouble. Broken goods. A human life is not a line on a ledger. Mr. Grimes, Clara's voice was ice. And children are not goods to be traded by rich men. You write the paper. Grimes wrote. He snatched the dollar. Clara turned to the twins. The boy was watching her with wide, terrified eyes. Clara didn't rush them. She knelt slowly on the floorboards. It was hard with the baby, but she did it. She needed to be on their exact level. I'm Clara, she said softly. I have a wagon outside. It's cold, but I have thick blankets. Will you come with me? Lily peeked out from behind her brother. She looked at Leo. Leo looked at Clara. He saw something in her face. He nodded, just once. The ride back to the farm was brutal. The wind howled. The snow started to fall in thick, heavy sheets. Clara drove the old draft horse with numb hands. She kept glancing back. The twins were huddled together under a heavy buffalo quilt. They didn't make a sound. Clara's back ached. Her heart hammered. She had no money. She had no husband. She had a massive target on her back now. But as she looked at the kids, a quiet strength settled over her. You don't need blood to make a family. You just need the courage to stay. They reached the cabin just as the sun gave up. The sky turned a bruised purple. Clara got the fire going. The cabin was small, peeling walls, bare floors, but the hearth was warm. She heated a pot of thin potato soup. She set 2 bowls on the wooden table. Eat, she told them. It's yours. Leo ate fast, like the food might disappear. Lily ate slowly. She kept watching the door. She was right to watch it. It happened an hour after dark. The sound of heavy hoofbeats cut through the howling wind. Clara froze. The baby kicked hard against her ribs. The front door didn't just open. It was kicked inward. The heavy wood smashed against the wall. Snow swirled into the room. 2 men stepped inside. They wore heavy dusters. Their boots tracked mud and slush across Clara's clean floor. Clara knew them. Silas Vance ranch hands. The one in front had a scarred chin and a mean smile. Evening, widow, the scarred man said. Leo dropped his spoon. He shoved Lily behind him. They backed into the corner. Clara stood up. She didn't retreat. Get out of my house, Clara said. The man laughed. He walked over to the wooden dining chair. He kicked it. The dry wood splintered and snapped. The chair collapsed into pieces on the floor. Lily whimpered. Mr. Vance hears you paid a visit to the orphanage today, the man said. He stepped closer. He looked at her pregnant belly with plain disgust. He says you took something that belongs to him. He says your husband owed him, and now you owe him. Arthur S. debts died with him, Clara said. Vance doesn't see it that way. He wants the kids, and he wants this land. You got 1 week to pack up and walk away. Widow, or next time, it won't be a chair that gets broken. The man reached out. He tried to grab the edge of Clara's table to flip it over. Clara moved fast. She grabbed the heavy iron fire poker resting by the hearth. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She swung it up and slammed the heavy iron tip down onto the table, barely an inch from the man's fingers. The crack echoed like a gunshot. The man jerked his hand back. His eyes went wide. You can break my chairs, Clara said. Her chest heaved. Her grip on the iron poker was white-knuckled. But you will not break me, and you will not touch these children. You go back and tell Silas Vance that respect isn't born from a thick wallet, and it sure isn't born from bullying women and orphans. Get off my property. The 2 men stared at her. They looked at the iron poker. They looked at the fierce, unyielding fire in her eyes. She was a pregnant widow in a rundown shack, but right now she looked like a force of nature. The scarred man spat on the floor. 1 week. He muttered. He turned and walked out. The second man followed. The door hung open. The wind howled through the gap. Clara walked over and forced the broken door shut. She dropped the heavy wooden latch into place. Then her knees shook. She leaned against the wood, closing her eyes and taking a long, shaky breath. She felt a small tug on her skirt. She opened her eyes. Leo was standing there. He wasn't hiding in the corner anymore. He looked up at her. His bruised face was perfectly serious. You didn't let them take us, Leo whispered. Clara dropped the iron poker. She sank to her knees on the cold floor, ignoring the sharp ache in her back. She pulled Leo into a hug. A second later, she felt Lilia's small arms wrapped tightly around her neck. I will never let them take you. Clara promised into the dark hair of the children. Never outside. The Montana blizzard raged. The wind tore at the roof. Silas Vance would be back. He would bring more men. He would bring guns. Clara knew she had started a war. She was a widow with nothing left to her name. But as she held the trembling orphans close to the fire, she knew one thing for certain. Vance had picked a fight with the wrong mother. The storm did not knock. It tore through the valley like a wild animal. Snow piled high against the cabin walls. The wind screamed through the gaps in the timber. Clara kept the fire roaring. She had to. Leo and Lily were huddled together on the braided rug, wrapped in her thickest buffalo quilt. They watched the flames with wide, silent eyes. Clara paced the small room. Her hand rested on her swollen belly. She was exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that settled deep into the marrow, but she couldn't sleep. Silas Vance's men had promised to return. Then she heard it. Not the wind. A thud, heavy and dull. It came from the front porch. Clara froze. She looked at the door. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Leo sat up straight. He pulled his sister tighter against his side. Clara walked to the fireplace. She picked up the iron poker. She stepped toward the door. Stay there, she whispered to the twins. She lifted the heavy wooden latch. She pulled the door open just an inch. The freezing wind whipped her hair across her face. She looked down. A man was lying on her porch. He was face down in the snow. He wore a long canvas duster, heavily caked in ice. A wide-brimmed hat lay a few feet away. But that wasn't what made Clara gasp. It was the blood. A stark, brilliant crimson stained the pure white snow beneath him. It was a lot of blood. Clara didn't hesitate. She threw the door wide open. The storm rushed in. But she didn't care. She dropped the poker and dropped to her knees. "Leo," Clara shouted over the howling wind. "I need you." The 9-year-old boy didn't freeze. He scrambled up from the rug and ran to the door. "Grab his arm," Clara ordered. "Pull." The man was heavy, dead weight. Clara gritted her teeth. Pain flared in her lower back, but she pushed it down. She hooked her arms under the man's broad shoulders. Leo pulled at his heavy leather sleeve. Together, they dragged him over the threshold. Clara kicked the door shut. The sudden silence in the cabin was deafening. The man groaned, a low, ragged sound. Clara rolled him onto his back. He was young, maybe 30, dark hair, a jawline carved from granite, and scars. Faded lines crossed his cheek and chin. But the real problem was his side. His coat was soaked through with fresh blood. "He had been shot, Lily," Clara said. Her voice was sharp and clear. "Bring me the boiling water from the stove. Leo, get the clean rags from the bottom drawer." The twins moved fast. They didn't panic. They had seen violence before. Clara hated that fact, but right now, she needed their focus. Clara unbuttoned the man's heavy coat. She tore his bloody shirt open. The bullet wound was ugly. It was just above his hip. She pressed a clean rag hard against the wound. The man's eyes flew open. They were a piercing, stormy gray. He gasped. His hand shot up. His fingers locked around Clara's wrist like a steel vise. "Easy," Clara said. She didn't pull away. She looked right into those wild gray eyes. "You're safe, but you're bleeding to death on my floor. Let go of my wrist so I can stop it." He stared at her. He looked at her pregnant belly. He looked at the bloody rag. Slowly, his grip loosened. His head fell back against the floorboards. "Need to get it out," he ground out. His voice was rough. "Like crushed gravel, I know," Clara said. She cleaned the wound. She didn't have whiskey to dull the pain. She only had a pair of iron tweezers she had sterilized in the fire. "Hold him," Clara told Leo. The boy put his small hands on the man's broad shoulders. Clara took a deep breath. She went to work. It took 10 agonizing minutes. The man didn't scream. He just bit down on his leather glove until he tasted his own blood. Finally, Clara heard the metal click. She pulled the tweezers back. A twisted piece of lead dropped onto the floorboards with a heavy clink. Clara packed the wound. She bound it tight with clean strips of linen. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking. She sat back on her heels. The man was breathing heavily. His eyes were half open. He turned his head slightly. The firelight flickered across his face. Then his gaze drifted past Clara. He saw the twins. Leo and Lily were standing near the hearth. They were watching him. The man's body went completely rigid. The color drained from his face. It wasn't the pain. It was pure, unadulterated shock. He stared at Leo's dark hair. He stared at Lilia's green eyes. His lips moved, a faint whisper. "Arthur's kids." Clara frowned. She leaned closer. "What did you say?" But the man's eyes rolled back. He passed out cold on her floor. The cowboy woke up 2 days later. The storm had finally broken. Pale winter sunlight filtered through the frosted windows. Clara was sitting at the wooden table. She was mending a torn shirt. She heard a groan from the cot in the corner. She set her needle down. She walked over. The man's gray eyes were open. They were clear now, and sharp. He looked around the rundown cabin. He took in the peeling wood, the empty cupboards, and finally, the pregnant widow standing over him. "You saved my life," he said. "It wasn't a question. You bled all over my floor." Clara replied evenly. "It seemed like a fair trade. I'm Clara Miller. Who are you?" He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. "Jace," he said. "Jace Caldwell." "Well, Mr. Caldwell, you were shot on my property." I'd ask why, but I have a feeling the answer brings trouble. Trouble usually follows me. "Mrs. Miller." Jace pushed himself up. He winced, grabbing his side. "But I pay my debts. I owe you a life. I stay until I work it off." "I can't pay you," Clara said. "I can barely feed the children. I didn't ask for money. Jace swung his legs over the edge of the cot. I asked for a job. Clara looked at him. She needed the help. The farm was dying. But a stranger with a gun was a risk. Still, she had taken a bigger risk, spending her last dollar on 2 orphans. Fine, Clara said, but you sleep in the barn. Jace proved his worth fast. He was relentless. He chopped wood until the pile reached the roofline. He fixed the leaking roof. He repaired the broken fences. More importantly, he watched the twins. He didn't treat them like fragile glass. He treated them like people. He showed Leo how to hold an axe properly. He showed Lily how to approach the draft horse without spooking it. You respect the animal. Jace told Lily one afternoon in the snowy yard, "You don't own it. You partner with it. Same goes for people. You demand respect by giving it first." Clara watched from the porch. She smiled. It was a good lesson. But peace on the frontier was always temporary. It happened on a Tuesday. The sun was dipping below the ridge. Clara was in the kitchen. Jace was in the barn. 3 riders crested the hill. They wore heavy dusters, Silas Vance's men. They didn't ride toward the house. They rode straight toward the barn. One of them carried a lit torch. Clara's heart dropped. She ran to the door. Jace. She didn't need to yell. The barn doors kicked open. Jace stepped out into the dying light. He didn't look injured. He looked lethal. A Winchester rifle was tucked firmly against his shoulder. The riders pulled up hard. The horses danced in the snow. "Get off this property," Jace called out. His voice was calm. It carried over the cold air. "This ain't your fight, cowboy," the lead rider spat. "Vance wants this land cleared. We're clearing it, starting with the barn." He raised the torch. Jace didn't blink. He pulled the trigger. The rifle cracked. The bullet shattered the wooden handle of the torch right in the rider's hand. The burning pitch fell into the snow and fizzled out. The riders froze. Jace racked the lever of the Winchester. A fresh shell clicked into the chamber. "Next one goes through your knee," Jace said. "Ride back to Vance. Tell him Clara Miller isn't alone anymore. This land is protected." The riders looked at the rifle. They looked at Jace's cold gray eyes. They yanked their reins and rode hard back over the ridge. Clara ran out to the yard. She was breathing hard. The twins were right behind her. Jace lowered the rifle. He looked at Clara. He saw her shaking hands. He walked past her. He went into the house. A minute later, he came back out. He was holding a heavy Colt revolver. He walked up to Clara. He held the gun out to her, handle first. Clara stared at it. "I don't know how to shoot." "Then I will teach you," Jace said. Clara shook her head. "I'm a woman. I'm pregnant. I shouldn't be handling a weapon." Jace didn't pull the gun back. His eyes locked onto hers. "Clara," he said softly, but his voice carried an absolute certainty. "God created men and women, but Mr. Samuel Colt made them equal. Violence doesn't care if you're a mother or a widow. It just cares if you're an easy target." He took her hand. He pressed the cold steel grip into her palm. "You do not need a man to save you," Jace said. "You just need to know how to pull the trigger. Never let a man tell you you're defenseless again." Clara looked down at the gun. It was heavy. It was dangerous. But as her fingers wrapped around the grip, she felt something new. Power. Agency. The right to defend her own life. She looked up at Jace. She nodded. "Show me," Clara said. The days grew shorter. The nights grew colder. But inside the cabin, something was warming up. The hostility between Clara and Jace began to fade. It didn't happen overnight. It happened in the quiet spaces between the chores. Jace was a man of few words, but Clara noticed the way he watched her. Not with pity. Never with pity. He watched her with a quiet, burning respect. He saw how hard she worked. He saw how she sacrificed her own meals so the twins could eat a little more. And Clara saw him. She saw the way his broad shoulders relaxed when Lily laughed. She saw the way he discreetly left a carved wooden horse on Leo's bedroll. He was a dangerous man. Clara knew that. The scars on his face and the ease with which he held a rifle proved it. But his hands were incredibly gentle when they didn't hold a weapon. The real shift happened at midnight. Clara woke up to a sound that chilled her blood. A scream. It was a high, piercing sound of pure terror. It came from the corner where the twins slept. Clara struggled to sit up in the dark. Her heavy belly made moving fast impossible. She grabbed the edge of the bed. Before she could stand, the front door opened. Jay stepped inside. He had run from the barn. He didn't have his coat on. The freezing air rushed in with him. He went straight to the corner. Lily was thrashing on her bedroll. Her eyes were squeezed shut. She was trapped in a nightmare. A memory from before Clara found them. A memory of pain. Leo was hovering over her. He looked terrified. He didn't know how to wake her. Clara reached them, just as Jace dropped to his knees. Most men would have shaken her awake. Most men would have told her to be quiet, to stop crying. Jace didn't do that. He didn't touch her. He just sat cross-legged on the floor, right next to her bedroll. Lily, Jace said. His voice was a low, steady rumble, like thunder miles away. Lily kept thrashing. She sobbed. Lily, listen to my voice, Jace said softly. You're not there anymore. You're here. You're in Clara's house. The walls are thick. The fire is warm. And I am sitting right here. Lily's thrashing slowed. She let out a ragged breath. Jace didn't stop talking. Did I ever tell you about the wild mustangs out in the Wyoming basin? He asked. His tone was casual. Rhythmic. They run so fast. They look like shadows on the grass. The lead stallion. He's a massive black brute. He watches the horizon while the herd sleeps. Nothing gets past him. Lily opened her eyes. They were wide and wet with tears. She looked at Jace in the dim firelight. Nothing, she whispered. Nothing, Jace promised. He stands guard, just like I am standing guard right now. You are safe, little bird. Close your eyes. Clara stood in the shadows. She watched the hardened, scarred cowboy sit on the floor of a freezing cabin, spinning tales of wild horses to soothe a terrified little girl. He stayed there. He kept his voice low and steady. He talked about rivers and mountains and endless blue skies. 10 minutes later, Lily was fast asleep. Her breathing was slow and even. Leo had curled up next to her, asleep as well. Jace finally stopped talking. He leaned back against the rough timber wall. He rubbed a hand over his tired face. Clara stepped into the firelight. Jace looked up. He tensed slightly, as if he had been caught doing something wrong. You didn't have to come in from the cold, Clara said quietly. I heard her scream, Jace said. He stood up. He looked away, staring into the dying embers of the fire. A kid shouldn't scream like that. She's been through a lot. They both have. Clara crossed her arms over her chest. Most men would have yelled at her to quiet down. Jace scoffed quietly. Most men are fools. You don't heal a bruised soul with a heavy hand. Clara, you heal it with time and patience. You meet them where they are. Clara looked at him. Really looked at him. She saw the tension in his jaw. She saw the shadows in his gray eyes. He wasn't just talking about the twins. He was talking about something deeper, a pain he carried himself. Where did you learn that, Jace? She asked softly. He didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the howling wind outside. From people who did it wrong, Jace finally said. His voice was tight. He turned to leave. He took a step toward the door. Jace, Clara called out. He stopped. He looked over his shoulder. You don't have to sleep in the barn tonight, Clara said. It's freezing. Take the extra rug near the hearth. Jace looked at the rug. Then he looked at Clara. The hard, icy walls he built around himself seemed to crack, just a little. Thank you, he murmured. He walked over to the fire. He laid out the rug. Clara went back to her bed. She pulled the quilt up to her chin. For the first time since Arthur died, she didn't lie awake listening to the wind, terrified of what the morning would bring. She listened to the steady, rhythmic breathing of the cowboy, sleeping by the fire. She felt safe, but out on the prairie, secrets rarely stay buried under the snow for long. And Jace Caldwell was carrying a secret that was about to burn their entire world to the ground. The cabin was silent, a heavy, suffocating kind of quiet. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The moon cast long, skeletal shadows through the frosted glass. Jace Caldwell could not sleep. He lay on the rug by the dying fire. He watched the embers pulse. His mind was a tangled knot of suspicion and guilt. He had watched Clara Miller for weeks. He had watched her feed 2 orphans before she fed herself. He had watched her stand up to armed men. She was good. She was kind. But Arthur Miller had been a monster. Jace knew this. It was a cold, hard fact. Monsters rarely kept innocent company. Did Clara know? Was her kindness just a desperate cover for a life built on stolen ground? Jace sat up. He threw off his wool blanket. He didn't make a sound. He walked to the back of the cabin. Arthur had kept a small study space near the pantry, a heavy oak desk, a single chair. Clara never went back there. It was a graveyard of bad memories. Jace knelt on the floorboards. He ran his fingertips over the rough wood. He felt for a seam, a loose nail, a gap. Men who kept secrets always left a trail. You just had to know where to look. His thumb caught on a raised edge. He pulled his hunting knife from his boot. He slipped the blade into the crack. He pried upward. The wood groaned. A sharp, high squeak in the dead of night. He froze. He waited. Nothing. Just the sound of the wind. He pulled the floorboard up. Beneath it was a dark cavity. He reached his hand into the freezing dust. His fingers brushed against cold metal. He pulled it out. It was an iron lockbox, heavy, rusted at the hinges. Put it back. The voice was soft. It was also completely steady. Jace turned his head. Clara stood in the doorway of the kitchen. She wore a thick cotton nightgown. Her heavy shawl was wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and she was pointing the Colt revolver directly at his chest. Her hands were not shaking. Jace had taught her well. "You're a guest in my house." "Jace," Clara said. Her voice carried a terrible ache. "You saved my life, and I thought I saved yours. But if you are a thief, you will find out right now that I am not a helpless woman." Jace didn't reach for his own gun. He stayed on his knees. He looked up at her. "I'm not a thief, Clara," he said slowly. "Then what are you doing, tearing up my floor in the dark?" "I am looking for the truth." Clara frowned. The barrel of the gun didn't waver.
"What truth?"
"The truth about how your husband afforded this land. The truth about why Silas Vance wants those twins dead." Jace tapped the iron box. Arthur was in debt to Vance. But men like Vance don't lend money without collateral. What did Arthur give him? Clara's eyes darted to the box. She swallowed hard. She had wondered. She had spent countless sleepless nights wondering how Arthur had changed. How a man she married out of naive hope had turned into a cruel, secretive stranger. She slowly lowered the gun. She didn't put it away. She kept it at her side. "Open it," Clara said. Jace used his knife to snap the rusted lock. The metal gave way with a sharp crack. He flipped the heavy lid open. Inside, the box smelled of stale paper and cheap tobacco. Jace reached in. He pulled out a silver pocket watch. The metal was tarnished, but the engraving on the front was unmistakable. A soaring eagle over a twisted pine tree. Jace stopped breathing. His chest seized. He stared at the watch. His knuckles went bone white. "What is it?" Clara asked. She stepped closer. Jace couldn't speak. He set the watch down. He reached into the box again. He pulled out a leather-bound ledger. He opened it. He handed it to Clara. Clara took the book. She held it near the moonlight, spilling through the window. She recognized Arthur S. messy handwriting immediately, but she didn't understand the words. Not at first. It was a list of payments, bribes, and then there was a journal entry. Dated 2 years ago. Vance made the offer. $500. "I just have to leave the gate open at the crossing. The herd will trample the wagon. A tragic accident on the trail. The man and his wife will be gone. The kids survive. They go to Grimes at the county. Vance takes the land deed. I get my cut." Clara stopped reading. The air rushed out of her lungs. The room spun. She stumbled backward, hitting the wall. She slid down the rough timber until she hit the floor. "No," she whispered. Tears spilled hot and fast down her cheeks. She dropped the book. Arthur didn't just owe Silas Vance money. He was Vance's hired killer. He had murdered Leo and Lilia's parents. He had orchestrated the ambush. And then he had thrown the children away, like garbage. Clara looked at the shadows where the twins slept. She had brought them into the house of the man who ruined their lives. She had fed them from a table bought with their parents' blood. "I didn't know," Clara gasped. She looked at Jace. She was begging him to believe her. "Jace, I swear to God I didn't know." Jace looked at her. He saw the sheer, unfiltered horror in her eyes, the physical revulsion. He saw the truth. She was innocent. He walked over to her. He knelt in front of her. "I know," Jace said softly. Clara buried her face in her hands. She wept, a deep, agonizing sound of grief and shame. "They have nothing." Clara sobbed. "Because of him. Because of this house. It's all poison." Jace reached out. He gently pulled her hands away from her face. Jace said. His voice was firm. It demanded her attention. "Listen to me, Clara. Evil is a choice. Arthur chose it. You didn't. You took your last dollar and you bought their freedom. You brought them in out of the cold. You gave them a mother. Clara shook her head. I don't deserve them. Family isn't about blood, Jace told her fiercely. It isn't about the name you carry. It's about who stands between you and the wolves. You are the only good thing that has happened to those kids. Clara looked at him. Her breathing slowed. The panic retreated, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. She wiped her face. She looked at the ledger on the floor. Vance stole their land, Clara said. Her voice was no longer shaking. It was made of iron. He used my husband to do it. Yes. Clara picked up the ledger. She closed it with a heavy thud. Then we are going to take it back, she said. I will not let Arthur S. sins dictate those children's future. They have rights. They are human beings, not collateral. We will see Silas Vance hang. Jace stared at her. He saw the fire in her eyes. He felt a profound, overwhelming surge of respect. But as he looked at the silver pocket watch on the floor, a cold dread pooled in his stomach. Clara knew Arthur's secret, but she didn't know his, and it was going to break her heart. The morning was bitter. A freezing rain had moved in before dawn. It coated the farm in a sheet of gray ice. The sky looked like bruised metal. Clara was in the barn. She needed to focus on something simple, something real. She was fixing a broken bridle. Jace was out on the far ridge, checking the fence line. Clara finished stitching the leather. She went to Jace's stall to grab a tin of saddle soap from his bag. He had left his saddlebags draped over the wooden partition. She popped the leather flap open. She reached inside. Her hand brushed past the tin of soap. Her fingers caught on a piece of thick folded paper. She pulled it out. It was old, frayed at the edges. It felt like a letter, folded inside a wanted poster. Clara unfolded it. The poster featured a drawing of Silas Vance, top enforcer. The man was dead now, shot in a bar fight in Wyoming. But it was the letter inside that stopped Clara's heart. It was addressed to Jason Caldwell. The handwriting was rushed, panicked. Jace, it's your brother, Thomas. Vance is closing in. He wants the valley. He bought off a local farmer named Arthur Miller to sabotage our water lines. If anything happens to me and Mary, find the kids. Find Leo and Lily. Take the land back. Promise me. Clara stared at the ink. The barn vanished. The sounds of the horses faded away. Your brother, Thomas. Jace wasn't a drifting cowboy. He wasn't a random stranger who got shot in the snow. He was Thomas Caldwell's younger brother. He was Leo and Lily's uncle. Clara's hands began to shake. Not with grief this time, with a rising, blinding fury. He had lied to her every day, every night by the fire. He hadn't stumbled onto her porch by accident. He had tracked her. He had infiltrated her home. He had played the wounded hero. He came to kill Arthur, and when he found Arthur dead, he stayed to use her to get to the kids. The barn doors creaked open. Jace walked in. He was soaking wet. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat. He was stomping the mud from his boots. He looked up. He smiled. A small, genuine thing. Then he saw her face. He saw the letter in her hand. The smile died. Clara didn't scream. She didn't cry. She reached into the deep pocket of her wool coat. She pulled out the heavy Colt revolver. She cocked the hammer. The metallic click echoed in the quiet barn. She pointed it straight at his chest. Step back, Clara said. Her voice was lethal. Jace froze. He held his hands up, open and empty. Clara, do not say my name, she hissed. She walked forward. She forced him back out the open barn doors, stepping out into the freezing, sleeting rain. The ice hit her face like needles. She didn't care. You lied to me, Clara said, her voice cracked, but the gun did not waver. You lied to those children. You sat by the fire and told Lily stories, and you never told her you were her blood. You let me think you cared about us. I do care, Jace said. Rain washed over his face. He didn't blink. He didn't look at the gun. He looked straight into her eyes. You came here to kill my husband. Clara said yes, Jace admitted. He didn't flinch. I swore on my brother's grave I would kill the man who betrayed him. I tracked Vance's men here. I got ambushed, and then you saved my life. So you used me, Clara yelled. The betrayal tore at her chest. You used a pregnant widow to get close to your niece and nephew, to get your revenge. At first, Jay stepped forward. The mud sloshed under his boots. Yes, I didn't know who you were. I thought you were in on it. I thought you were just as rotten as Arthur. Clara gripped the gun tighter. And now, Jace took another step. Clara leveled the gun at his heart. I will shoot you, Jace. I will not let another man use this family for his own war. Jace didn't stop. He walked right up to her. He didn't try to take the gun. He didn't try to defend himself. He let the cold steel barrel press directly against the center of his chest. He stood there, completely vulnerable, stripped of his armor, stripped of his lies. Then shoot me, Jace said softly. His gray eyes were entirely open. No walls, no shadows. Just raw, bleeding honesty. If you think I'm here to hurt you, pull the trigger. I won't stop you. Clara stared at him. Her breathing was ragged. I came here looking for a monster. Clara, Jace whispered over the sound of the freezing rain. I came looking for blood, but I found an angel instead. Clara's breath hitched. I found a woman who spent her last dollar on 2 broken kids, Jace continued. His voice broke. I found a woman who showed me that I don't have to live in the dark anymore. I didn't tell them who I was because I was ashamed, because I wasn't there to save my brother. But I am here now. He slowly reached up. He wrapped his large, calloused hand over her trembling hands. You are my family now, Jace said. You the baby, Leo and Lily. I will die before I let Silas Vance touch a single hair on your heads. I swear it. Clara looked into his eyes. She searched for a lie. She found none. She saw the same broken, healing soul that she carried in her own chest. The anger drained out of her. The exhaustion took its place. She let out a sob. She lowered the gun. Jace didn't hesitate. He pulled her against him. He wrapped his arms around her shivering body, pulling her tight against his chest. He buried his face in her wet hair. Clara dropped the gun in the mud. She wrapped her arms around his neck. She held on to him like he was the only solid thing left in the world. Jace tilted her chin up. The rain was freezing, but his mouth was hot. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It was a promise forged in the freezing rain. It was the collision of 2 people who had lost everything, finally finding a place to belong. Clara kissed him back. She poured all her fear, all her grief, and all her defiant hope into it. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. Jace rested his forehead against hers. We are going to town, Jace said fiercely. We are going to take the ledger to the marshal. We are ending this, Clara said. But as they turned back toward the cabin, a low, terrifying sound carried over the ridge. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of a dozen horses, riding hard. Silas Vance had figured out who the cowboy was, and he wasn't waiting for the law. The night exploded. A bullet shattered the front window. Glass sprayed across the wooden floor like deadly rain. Get down, Jace roared. He tackled Clara to the floorboards, just as a second volley of gunfire tore through the timber walls. The cabin descended into chaos. The roar of rifles from the tree line was deafening. Silas Vance hadn't sent a warning. He had sent an execution squad. Lily. Clara screamed over the gunfire. Here, Leo yelled. He was crawling on his belly from the corner. He had one hand clamped tightly around his sister's wrist, dragging her low beneath the window line. They scrambled under the heavy oak dining table. Jace rolled to his feet. He stayed crouched. He grabbed his Winchester from the mantel. He kicked over a heavy wooden bookshelf, barricading the broken window. How many? Clara asked, gasping. 10, maybe 12, Jace said. He racked the lever of the rifle. He peeked through a gap in the books. They've surrounded the front. He aimed into the dark. He fired. A cry of pain rang out from the brush. One down, but a barrage of answering fire hammered the cabin. Splinters of wood flew through the air. Clara tried to crawl toward the table to reach the twins. Suddenly, she stopped. A sharp, agonizing cramp seized her abdomen. It wasn't like the dull aches she had felt for weeks. This was a violent, tearing pain. It stole the air from her lungs. She grabbed her stomach. She let out a choked gasp. Clara, Jace yelled, ducking as a bullet smacked into the stone fireplace. My water, Clara gasped. She looked down. Her dress was soaked. It broke. Jace's head snapped toward her. Pure terror flashed in his gray eyes. Now you're 7 months. Tell that to the baby. Clara cried out as another contraction hit her. This one was harder. It doubled her over. The sheer terror of the siege had forced her body into early labor. Jace scrambled over to her. Bullets continued to thud against the thick logs of the cabin. I can't defend the windows and deliver a baby, Jace said. His voice was tight with panic. You have to shoot. Clara grabbed his collar. If they get inside, we all die. Shoot them, Jace. I'm out of shells in my pocket, Jace yelled. The box is on the kitchen counter. Leo slid out from under the table. I'll get it, the 9-year-old boy yelled. Leo, no, Clara screamed. But Leo was already moving. He crawled fast on his hands and knees. He stayed below the counter line. He reached up, his small hand grasping blindly, until his fingers curled around the heavy cardboard box of Winchester ammunition. He crawled back to Jace. He shoved the box into the cowboy's hands. I'll load, Leo said. His voice trembled, but his eyes were fierce. You have 2 rifles. I load one. You shoot the other. Like you taught me. Jace looked at his nephew. He saw the terrifying bravery of a child forced to grow up too fast. You're a brave man, Leo, Jace said. He handed him the empty rifle. Keep your head down. Jace spun around, took the loaded rifle, and fired 2 quick shots through the window. Another contraction ripped through Clara. She screamed, Lily. Clara cried out. The little girl scrambled out from under the table. She was terrified, but she didn't freeze. She crawled to Clara's side. What do I do? Lily asked, her voice shaking. Hold my hand, Clara gasped, and bring the lantern closer. I need to see. The cabin became a symphony of survival. It was a stark, brutal contrast. At the window, Jace fought a war of death. His face was smeared with gunpowder and sweat. He fired, dropped the empty rifle, and grabbed the loaded one from Leo's small, soot-stained hands. He was a machine, cold, lethal, protecting his blood. In the center of the room, Clara fought a war of life. She lay on her back on the braided rug. Lily sat by her head, holding the storm lantern steady, wiping Clara's sweating forehead with a damp cloth. Push, Clara, Lily encouraged, her high voice cutting through the roar of gunfire. You're so strong, push. They're rushing the porch, Jace roared. Footsteps thudded on the wooden planks outside. Jace drew his Colt revolver. He fired directly through the heavy wooden door. 3 rapid shots. A heavy body slammed against the wood and slid down to the porch. I can't, Clara screamed. The pain was blinding. It's too early. You can, Jace yelled back over his shoulder. He fired the Winchester again. You are Clara Miller? You stood down a county official with $1. You do not quit. Clara gripped Lily's small hand so hard the girl winced. But Lily didn't pull away. Clara bared her teeth. She channeled every ounce of fury, every ounce of grief, and every ounce of love she had for the people in this room. She pushed outside. Vance's men regrouped. They fired a massive volley. The cabin filled with smoke and the smell of sulfur. Last clip, Jace yelled. Fast ready, Leo shouted, shoving the rifle into Jace's hands. Jace rose up slightly. He locked his sights on the remaining shadows in the tree line. Clara let out a final primal scream. It echoed off the timber walls, louder than the gunfire. And then, a new sound pierced the smoke-filled air. A sharp, indignant, piercing cry. A baby. At the exact moment the baby cried, Jace pulled the trigger. His final bullet caught Silas Vance's lead enforcer, squarely in the chest. The man fell backward into the snow. The remaining mercenaries broke. Without their leader, their courage evaporated. They turned and fled into the dark timber, the sounds of their horses galloping away, fading into the freezing night. The gunfire stopped. The sudden silence in the cabin was heavy, broken only by the beautiful, angry wail of a newborn. Jace dropped his rifle. He turned around. Clara lay on the rug, exhausted, sweating, and weeping, but she was smiling. Wrapped in a clean, hastily grabbed apron was a tiny red-faced baby girl. Lily was crying with joy, gently stroking the baby's dark hair. Leo crawled over, his face black with gun smoke, staring at the newborn with wide-eyed wonder. Jace walked over. He dropped to his knees beside Clara. His hands were shaking violently now. The adrenaline was fading. He looked at Clara. He looked at the baby. She's breathing, Jace whispered. His eyes filled with tears. She's crying. She's alive. She is, Clara breathed. She looked up at the cowboy, the man who had just stood between her family and certain death. Jace leaned down. He pressed his forehead against Clara's. He kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then her lips. We did it, Jace whispered. No, Clara said softly, looking at the twins, and then at Jace. We did it. All of us. They were surrounded by shattered glass, bullet holes, and the smell of gunpowder. They had lost the cabin. Vance would undoubtedly be back tomorrow with the law in his pocket. But as Jace wrapped his arms around Clara, the baby and the twins he knew, Silas Vance had already lost. You can burn a house, but you cannot break a family forged in fire. Dawn broke like a bruised eye over the Montana ridge. The storm had finally exhausted itself. The wind died down to a low, hollow moan. Inside the shattered cabin, the air was freezing. The fire had burned down to white ash. Clara sat on the floor. She held her newborn daughter tight against her chest. The baby was bundled in two thick wool blankets. She was small, but her breathing was strong. Jace walked through the debris. Glass crunched under his boots. He had spent the last 2 hours securing the perimeter. Vance's men were gone, but they would not stay gone. They had retreated to regroup. When they came back, they would bring daylight and a larger pus. "We have to move," Jace said softly. He knelt beside Clara. His face was stained with gunpowder and exhaustion. He looked at the baby. His gray eyes softened. He reached out and gently brushed a smudge of soot from Clara's cheek. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I can walk," Clara said. Her body ached in ways she didn't know were possible. She had just given birth on a hard wooden floor during a gunfight, but the adrenaline was still burning in her veins. It was a cold, pure fire. Jace helped her up. He was incredibly gentle. He took the bulk of her weight against his side. Leo and Lily were already bundled in their coats. They stood by the door. They didn't complain about the cold. They didn't cry. They were survivors. "I hitched the wagon in the barn," Jace said. "I padded the bed with hay and every blanket we have left. We ride to town. We take the ledger straight to the mayor." Clara nodded. They moved out into the freezing morning. The snow was knee-deep. Jace carried Clara the last 10 yards to the barn. He lifted her into the back of the wagon. He placed the twins beside her. "Keep the baby between you," Jace told the kids. "Keep her warm." He climbed up to the driver's bench. He snapped the reins. The heavy draft horse pulled them forward, carving a fresh path through the deep snow. They reached the top of the ridge. Jace pulled the horse to a halt. He looked back. Clara pushed herself up slightly. She looked over the wooden edge of the wagon. Down in the valley, a bright orange glow fractured the gray morning. Flames, Silas Vance's men had returned sooner than expected. They were burning the cabin. The dry timber caught fast. A massive pillar of black smoke clawed its way up into the winter sky. Lily gasped. Leo grabbed his sister's hand. Clara watched her home burn. The place she had brought her husband. The place she had suffered. The place she had taken in 2 orphans. The place her daughter took her first breath. It was gone. "Don't look," Jace said. His voice was tight with suppressed rage. "No," Clara said. Her voice was surprisingly steady. "Let them look." "Look at it, Leo. Look at it." Lily, the twins stared at the fire. "That is what cowards do," Clara told them. "When they cannot break your spirit, they burn your wood. Let them have the wood. We have each other, and we are going to make them pay." Jace looked back at her. He saw the absolute iron in her spine. He nodded once. He whipped the reins. The wagon crested the hill and headed for Harlan Creek. Town was quiet when they arrived. The morning sun reflected off the snowbanks. A few shopkeepers were sweeping their porches. They stopped and stared as the wagon rolled down Main Street. It was a hell of a sight. A battered wagon, a cowboy armed to the teeth, 2 bruised orphans, and a pale, blood-stained widow holding a newborn baby. Jace pulled up in front of the town hall. It was a large, sturdy building. The mayor held a town council meeting every Thursday morning. Today was Thursday. The wealthy merchants and landowners of the valley would be inside. "Wait here," Jay said. "I'll go in. I'll clear the room." "No," Clara said. She handed the baby to Lily. "Hold her tight. Do not let anyone near this wagon." Clara grabbed the wooden side of the wagon. She pulled herself up. Her legs trembled violently. Pain shot up her spine, but she did not care. Jace saw her struggling. He jumped down and caught her by the waist. "Clara, you just gave birth," he whispered. "Let me fight this. This is not your fight." "Jace," Clara said, "you brought me the proof, but this is my town, and they need to see me." She reached into her heavy coat pocket. She pulled out Arthur S. Ledger. She turned and walked up the wooden steps of the town hall. Every step was agony. She left a faint trail of bloody snow behind her. Jace walked right behind her. His hand hovered inches from his revolver. He watched the street with predatory eyes. Clara pushed the double doors open. The council room was warm. It smelled of expensive cigars and fresh coffee. Mayor Higgins sat at the head of a long mahogany table. 5 other men sat with him. They all stopped talking. They stared at the doorway. Clara Miller stood there. Her dress was ruined. Her hair was wild. Her face was pale as a ghost, but her eyes burned like blue fire. Mrs. Miller, Mayor Higgins stammered. He stood up. He looked genuinely horrified. My God, woman, what happened to you? Silas Vance happened to me, Clara said. Her voice carried through the large room. It wasn't loud, but it commanded absolute silence. She walked slowly to the mahogany table. The wealthy men leaned back, instinctively shrinking away from the raw, bleeding reality standing in front of them. Clara slammed the leather-bound ledger down on the polished wood. That is a record, Clara said, written by my late husband, Arthur Miller. It details every bribe Silas Vance paid to this town's officials, and it details the murder of Thomas and Mary Caldwell. The men in the room went completely still. Vance paid my husband to stage the wagon accident that killed them, Clara continued. Also, Vance could steal the deeds to the Caldwell estate, the estate that belongs to the 2 children I pulled out of your corrupt orphanage. Mayor Higgins swallowed hard. He looked at the ledger. He didn't reach for it. Clara, these are heavy accusations, Higgins said. His voice wavered. Silas Vance is a respected man. He builds this town. He builds it on corpses, Clara shouted. The sudden volume made the men jump. She leaned over the table. She stared the mayor down. He sent 10 armed men to my home last night, Clara said. They shot out my windows. They tried to murder me, a pregnant woman, and 2 innocent children. They burned my farm to the ground an hour ago, all because I refused to hand over Leo and Lily. The council members exchanged nervous glances. They knew Vance was ruthless, but murder, burning women out of their homes in the dead of winter. You sit in this warm room, Clara said, her voice dropping to a dangerous hiss. You wear your fine suits. You talk about law, but there is no law in this valley. There is only money and fear. She turned to face the rest of the room. The door had been left open. A crowd of ordinary townsfolk had gathered in the hallway. Shopkeepers, blacksmiths, farmers. They were listening, Clara spoke to them. We let men like Silas Vance rule us because we think we are weak, Clara said. We think because they have the money. They have the right. They do not. She pointed a shaking finger at the ledger. Respect is not born from a thick wallet. It is not born from terror. Every human being in this valley has the right to live safely. You have the right to own your land without a gun to your head. We are born equal, and we deserve the protection of the law. If this mayor will not give it to us, then we must take it ourselves. The silence in the hall was electric. Clara looked back at Mayor Higgins. They can burn our homes, Mayor, Clara said quietly, but they cannot burn our right to live as free people. Stop kneeling to a tyrant. Send a rider to the U.S. Marshal in Helena. Now Higgins looked at the fierce widow. He looked at the hard, lethal cowboy standing behind her, and then he looked at the crowd in the hallway. The ordinary men and women were nodding. Some were clenching their fists. The fear in the room had shifted. It was no longer fear of Silas Vance. It was fear of a town waking up. Higgins reached out. He took the ledger. I will send the rider, Higgins whispered. Clara nodded. Her vision swam. The adrenaline was finally running out. The room tilted violently to the left. She didn't hit the floor. Jace caught her. He scooped her up into his arms effortlessly. You did it, Jace whispered into her hair. I've got you. He carried her out of the town hall. The crowd parted for them. They looked at Clara Miller with a new, profound reverence. She had walked in as a broken widow. She was being carried out as a queen of the prairie. The U.S. Marshal arrived 3 days later. His name was Bass. He was an older man with silver hair and a badge that looked like it had been through a war. He read Arthur S. Ledger in the parlor of the Town S. boarding house, where Clara and the children were resting. Bass closed the book. He looked at Jace. This is enough to hang him, Bass said. But Vance won't come quietly. He has 30 men on his payroll. If I ride up there with just my deputies, it's a slaughter. You won't ride alone, Jace said. Jace walked to the window. He pulled the curtain back. Out on the muddy main street, a crowd had gathered. They weren't just standing around. They were armed, shotguns, hunting rifles, old cavalry pistols. The blacksmith was there, the baker, the stable hands. Clara's speech had worked. The town had finally found its spine. Deputize them, Jace said. Vance's mercenaries fight for pay. These men fight for their homes. Pay stops mattering when the bullets start flying. Marshal Bass smiled grimly. I like how you think, Cowboy. They rode out an hour later. It was a small army, 50 men strong, riding for Silas Vance's sprawling ranch on the north side of the valley. But Jace did not ride with them. He slipped away from the main posse. He took a different trail. He knew Silas Vance. Men like Vance didn't stay and fight when the odds turned. They ran. They took their gold and they slipped out the back door. Jace knew exactly where Vance would go. The stagecoach rode south, cut right past the ruins of Clara's farm. Jace pushed his horse hard. The wind whipped at his face. His gray eyes were cold and focused. He was not going to let the man who ordered his brother's murder escape. He reached the ruins of the farm just as the sun began to dip toward the horizon. The cabin was entirely gone. Nothing was left but a blackened stone chimney and a smoking foundation of charred timber. The smell of wet ash was thick and bitter in the air. Jace dismounted. He tied his horse to the only surviving fence post. He didn't have to wait long. The sound of hoofbeats echoed down the trail. A single rider riding fast. It was Silas Vance. He wore a heavy fur coat. Saddlebags bulged on either side of his exhausted horse. He was fleeing the valley. Jay stepped out from behind the blackened chimney. He walked into the middle of the muddy trail. He unholstered his Colt revolver. He let it hang loosely by his thigh. Vance saw him. He pulled back hard on the reins. The horse reared up, kicking dirt and ash into the air. Vance stared at the lone cowboy blocking his path. Get out of my way, drifter. Vance spat. I'm not a drifter, Jace said. His voice carried over the quiet smoking ruins. My name is Jason Caldwell. I believe you knew my brother. Thomas Vance's face went completely pale. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The cowboy who had been a thorn in his side. The man who had protected the widow. It all made sense now. Vance recovered quickly. A cruel, arrogant sneer twisted his lips. Thomas Vance sneered. He was a weak man. He didn't know how to use the land. I took it because it belonged to someone who understood progress. That is how the world works. Boy, the strong take from the weak. There is no strength in murder, Jace said evenly. There is no strength in burning women out of their homes. You're just a thief with a bank account. Vance's eyes narrowed. His hand drifted slowly toward the heavy revolver strapped to his hip. You think you're faster than me? Vance asked. I know I am, Jace said. The silence stretched. It was tight, suffocating. The wind blew a cloud of black ash between them. Vance drew. He was fast. A lifetime of frontier violence had trained his hands. But Jace Caldwell was lightning. Jace didn't even aim down the sights. He shot from the hip. The Colt roared. The bullet struck the cylinder of Vance's revolver right as the man pulled it from the holster. The impact was violent. The gun shattered in Vance's hand. The kinetic force spun Vance completely off his horse. He hit the muddy ground with a heavy thud. Jace walked forward. He cocked the hammer of his Colt. Vance scrambled backward in the mud. He clutched his bleeding right hand. His expensive fur coat was ruined. He looked up at Jace. He saw the cold, merciless executioner in the cowboy's eyes. Do it, Vance hissed. He spat a mouthful of blood. Avenge your pathetic brother. Become exactly what you hate. Jace stood over him. The barrel of the Colt was pointed directly between Vance's eyes. This was the moment. The moment Jace had dreamed about for 2 years. The moment he had bled for. He just had to squeeze his finger. 1 fraction of an inch, and the debt was paid in blood. He thought about his brother, but then he thought about Clara. He thought about Clara's fierce eyes. He thought about Leo's bravery loading the rifles. He thought about Lilia's small hand wiping Clara's brow. He thought about the baby's first cry. He was not a killer, not anymore. He was a father now. Jace slowly uncocked the hammer. He lowered the gun. No, Jace said quietly. Vance stared at him, confused. My hands are meant to hold my wife and kids, Jace said. His voice was completely steady. I won't stain them with your filthy blood. You aren't worth my soul. Jace turned around. He looked down the trail. Marshal Bass was riding up the ridge, followed by a small group of deputies. Clara was driving a wagon right behind them. She had insisted on coming. The marshal is here, Jace said without looking back. You are going to hang in a cage. Vance, everybody is going to watch you die small. Jace took a step toward Clara's wagon. Behind him, Vance's face twisted into a mask of pure, humiliated rage. He reached into his left boot. He pulled out a hidden, two-shot silver derringer. Die, you son of a bitch, Vance screamed. He aimed the small gun right at Jace's back. Jace spun around, but he was too late. He wouldn't be able to draw in time. A gunshot rang out, a massive, deafening boom. It didn't come from Vance's derringer. Silas Vance froze. His eyes went wide. The derringer slipped from his fingers. He collapsed backward into the ash, a gaping hole in his chest. He was dead before he hit the ground. Jace looked past Vance's body. Clara stood in the bed of the approaching wagon. She was holding Jace's heavy Winchester rifle against her shoulder. Smoke curled from the long barrel. She lowered the rifle. She didn't look horrified. She looked fiercely protective. Jace walked over to the wagon. He looked up at her. You told me never to let a man tell me I was defenseless, Clara said. Her voice shook just a little. Jace smiled. It was a bright, beautiful, unrestrained smile. He reached up. Clara dropped the rifle and climbed down into his arms. He caught her and held her tight against his chest. I love you, Jace whispered into her hair. God, I love you. Clara buried her face in his neck. I love you too. Let's go home. They looked around at the burnt ruins of the farm. The timber was gone, but the land remained, and the land was enough. 6 months later, spring had not just arrived in Montana. It had exploded. The valley was a sea of emerald green grass. Wildflowers painted the ridges in vibrant strokes of purple and yellow. The creeks ran high and clear with snowmelt. The Caldwell estate was alive again. It had taken 3 months for the courts in Helena to process the paperwork. With Arthur Sledger and Silas Vance dead, the truth was undeniable. The massive cattle empire Vance had built was dismantled. The original deeds were restored. Leo and Lily Caldwell were the wealthiest children in the territory, but they didn't live in Vance's gaudy mansion in town. They had sold it instead. They used the money to rebuild right over the ashes of Clara's old farm. The new house was magnificent. It was built from thick golden pine. It had a sweeping wraparound porch, massive glass windows that let in the morning light, and a stone chimney big enough to roast a whole pig. The barn was twice the size of the old one. The fences were strong and new. Jace was out in the corral. He was working a young, spirited Mustang. He didn't use a whip. He didn't use spurs. He used patience. He stood in the center of the dirt ring, murmuring softly to the nervous animal. Leo sat on the top rail of the fence. He was 10 now. He looked healthy. The hollow look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a bright, eager intelligence. He swung his legs and watched his uncle work. He's fighting the bit, Uncle Jace. Leo called out. He's not fighting the bit, Leo, Jace corrected gently. He's fighting the idea of giving up control. You have to show him that trusting you is better than running away. It takes time, Leo nodded. He understood. He had learned that lesson himself. Up on the porch, Clara was sitting in a rocking chair. She looked radiant. The pale, exhausted widow from the winter was gone. Her cheeks were flush with color. She wore a bright blue dress that caught the spring wind. She was feeding the baby. Little Hope. They hadn't named her after anyone. They named her after the thing that had kept them all alive in the darkest part of the winter. Hope was 6 months old, chubby, and fiercely opinionated. She waved her small fists in the air, babbling at a stray dog sleeping on the porch steps. Lily sat at Clara's feet. She was reading a thick book on botany. Clara, Lily said, looking up from the pages. Did you know that some pine trees need fire to open their cones? The seeds can't grow until the fire burns the old wood away. Clara stopped rocking. She looked out at the beautiful, sprawling ranch. She looked at the exact spot where the old, rotting cabin used to stand. I suppose that's true for a lot of things, Lily, Clara said softly. The sun began to set. The golden hour hit the valley. It turned the green grass to copper and painted the sky in streaks of violently beautiful pink and orange. Jace finished in the corral. He handed the reins to one of their new, well-paid ranch hands. He walked up to the porch. He wiped the dust from his hands on his denim trousers. He stopped in front of Clara. "Walk with me," Jace asked. Clara smiled. She handed Hope down to Lily. Lily took the baby with practiced ease, immediately bouncing her on her hip. Clara took Jace's hand. They walked off the porch. They walked out into the pasture, away from the sounds of the house. The evening air was cool and sweet. They stopped near a large oak tree on the edge of the property. Jace turned to face her. The golden light caught the faded scars on his face. He looked at her with that same intense, burning respect he had shown her since the night she pulled a bullet from his side. "I owe you a life, Clara Miller," Jace said quietly. "You paid that debt in the blizzard," Clara replied. "No," Jace shook his head. "I didn't. I survived the blizzard. But you gave me a life. I was a ghost before I met you. I was just walking around waiting to die so I could see my brother again. You brought me back. You gave me a family." Clara's throat tightened. "You gave me one too." Jace reached into his shirt pocket. He didn't pull out a velvet box. He didn't pull out a massive, expensive diamond. He held out his hand. Sitting in his calloused palm was a simple, thick silver ring. Clara looked closely at it. The metal was dull, but beautiful. There were faint, smoothed-out markings on the inside of the band. Letters, E pluribus unum. Clara gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. "You kept it," Clara whispered. "When Grimes ran out of town, I found it in his desk," Jace said. "I took it to the blacksmith in Helena. I told him to melt it down. I told him to make something that could never be spent, something that lasts. It was the silver dollar, the single coin Clara had slammed on the orphanage desk, the coin she had used to buy 2 lives, the coin that had started everything." Jace slowly dropped to one knee in the tall grass. He looked up at the woman who had defied wealthy barons, delivered a baby in a gunfight, and taught him how to love again. "I don't have a lot of pretty words, Clara," Jace said, "but I have these hands, and I want them to hold you, and Hope, and the twins, for the rest of my days on this earth. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled over Clara's eyelashes. They were not tears of grief. They were tears of absolute, profound joy. She didn't nod. She didn't say yes. She dropped to her knees in the grass right in front of him. She took the ring from his palm and slid it onto her own finger. It fit perfectly. Then she grabbed the collar of his shirt and kissed him. It was a kiss that tasted like spring, like fresh rain and new beginnings. It was the kiss of 2 people who had walked through the fire and come out forged in steel. When they finally stood up, Jace wrapped his arm around her waist. They looked back at the house. Leo was running across the porch, chasing the dog. Lily was laughing, holding baby Hope up to see the sunset. Smoke drifted lazily from the massive stone chimney. They were not a family built by blood alone. They were a family built by choice, built by shared scars, fierce loyalty, and the unshakable belief that every human being deserves a place to call home. Jace kissed the top of Clara's head. The sun dipped below the mountains, closing the book on the harsh winter, and opening the door to a bright, beautiful destiny. The opinions, actions, and decisions expressed by the characters in this story do not reflect the views or beliefs of the author. Certain scenes may contain dramatic situations, emotional conflict, or morally complex behavior intended solely to serve the fictional storyline and enhance the audience viewing experience. As the sun settles beyond the Montana mountains and the last golden light falls across the home Clara, Jace, Lily, and little Hope built together, we are reminded that the greatest fortunes in this world are rarely measured in cattle, land, or silver. Sometimes, the greatest fortune begins with a single dollar, offered by someone who has almost nothing left, but still refuses to turn away from another human being in need. Clara walked into that orphanage as a pregnant widow burdened by debt, grief, and uncertainty. By every measure the world understood, she was powerless. She had no wealthy family behind her, no army of hired men, and no promise that tomorrow would be kinder than today. Yet she possessed something Silas Vance with all his money and influence, could never purchase the courage to recognize that every life has value. That silver dollar did not buy 2 children. It broke the chains of fear that had held them captive. It was a declaration that Leo and Lily were not unwanted goods, not obstacles standing between a greedy man and a piece of land, but human beings worthy of safety, dignity, and love. Clara teaches us that true motherhood is not created by blood alone. A mother is the person who stands between a frightened child and the wolves outside the door. She is the one who says, "You are safe with me," even when her own hands are trembling. She is the one who gives away her final meal, faces armed men with nothing but an iron poker, and finds strength she never knew she possessed because someone smaller is depending on her. But this story is not only about Clara saving the children. It is also about the way love allows wounded people to save one another. Jace arrived at her door, carrying a bullet in his body and vengeance in his heart. He believed his life had only one purpose left, to punish the men responsible for his brother's death. Yet inside that cold, broken cabin, he discovered something stronger than revenge. He discovered a family waiting to be protected, a woman who respected him without fearing him, and children who needed patience more than violence. Jay's greatest victory was not defeating Silas Vance in the ashes. It was lowering his gun when hatred told him to fire. In that moment, he understood that justice and revenge are not the same thing. Revenge asks us to become like the people who hurt us. Justice asks us to remain human while holding evil accountable. Jace chose not to sacrifice his soul for a moment of satisfaction. He chose to become a husband, an uncle, and a father instead of remaining an executioner. That choice reveals one of the deepest truths in this story. Our past may explain our scars, but it does not have the right to decide our future. Clara was not responsible for Arthur's crimes. Jace was not condemned to live forever in his brother's grave. Leo and Lily were not destined to remain frightened orphans. Every one of them carried pain they did not deserve. But together they transformed that pain into loyalty, courage, and compassion. Even the fire that destroyed Clara's cabin could not destroy them. It burned away rotten timber, painful memories, and the last physical remains of Arthur's betrayal. But it left behind the land on which something better could be built. Like the pine cones Lily described, some lives cannot release their seeds until the old wood has burned away. The fire did not end their story. It opened the ground for a new beginning. And perhaps that is the lesson we should carry with us after leaving this valley. Losing a house does not mean losing a home. A house is made of walls, windows, and boards. A home is made of people who stay when the walls fall. Wealth can build a mansion, but only love can build a family. Fear can silence a town for years, but one brave voice can remind ordinary people that they were never truly powerless. Silas Vance controlled the valley because everyone believed they stood alone. Clara defeated him by showing them they did not. The moment the townspeople stood shoulder to shoulder, the tyrant's power began to disappear. Evil grows whenever good people believe their courage is too small to matter. Clara's story proves that courage does not need to be loud, wealthy, or